Hi everyone, and welcome to this panel on security cooperation after Brexit. We've got three fantastic speakers: Mircea, Geoana, who is NATO Deputy Secretary General and has been since October 2019. We've got David McAllister, who is a German MEP, Vice President of the European People's Party and Chair of the Committee on Foreign Affairs. And finally, Lisa Nandy, who is a British MEP, represents Wigan and has done since 2010 and is now the Shadow Foreign Secretary. I'd suggest, if it's okay, we go in that order. So Mircea, then David, then Lisa, if everyone's happy with that. So Mircea, can I ask you to kick us off without further ado? You've got to love technology. Mircea's definitely here. I've got a message saying logged in. Mircea, are you all right to kick us off? Okay, David, are you able to step in?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you very much.
Okay, well then I'll step in. First of all, thanks for inviting me. I'm glad to participate, talking a bit about security cooperation after Brexit. As you just mentioned, I am the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the European Parliament, but I have another role. I also chair the UK Coordination Group. This is a body set up in February as the parliamentary counterpart to Michel Barnier's UK task force. We coordinate the European Parliament's position on the ongoing negotiations. Our group includes representatives from all political groups in the European Parliament and some of the relevant parliamentary committee chairs. Now, despite the challenges and the difficult circumstances around the COVID-19 pandemic, the European Parliament has continued to scrutinize the negotiating process in the last few weeks, and also the implementation of the withdrawal agreement. You may have followed that on the 18th of June, the European Parliament adopted a report on the ongoing negotiations with an overwhelming majority of 572 colleagues in favor, 34 against, and 91 abstaining. So once again, as we did in our previous resolution on the proposed mandate on the negotiations on the 12th of February, we proved that the Parliament is united and it stands firmly behind our chief negotiator, Michel Barnier. Now, in this resolution, Parliament stressed three important points. Firstly, tangible progress is needed in all areas in parallel. The European Parliament will not accept any kind of cherry picking. Secondly, the European Parliament will not agree to a deal at any cost. And thirdly, the implementation of the withdrawal agreement with all its protocols, especially the protocol on Ireland and Northern Ireland, remains one of our key priorities. Now, on security and foreign affairs aspects, first of all, it's always important to underline that for us, the UA mandate for the new partnership between the EU and the UK is based on the political declaration of the 17th of October 2019, painstakingly negotiated at that time by both sides. Now, this declaration in paragraphs 78 and 79, quote, envisages an ambitious, broad, deep and flexible partnership in the field of foreign policy, security and defence. It also calls for the establishment of a future broad, comprehensive and balanced EU-UK security partnership, unquote. So this was agreed by both sides in October last year. Unfortunately, when it came to the negotiations, as we are well aware, the UK government didn't want to have a negotiating table on foreign policy and security. So at the end of the transition period, the UK will become a third country without any specific framework of relations in this field. This, of course, will have an impact on existing cooperation in foreign and security policy. I regret this. I firmly believe it would be for the benefit of both parties to embrace a deeply integrated and coordinated cooperation in international fora, given the similar approaches towards effective multilateralism, safeguarding peace, security, and sustainability, as well as defending human rights. Finally, the Commission has proposed in its draft treaty a separate legal text for cooperation in foreign affairs, security, and defence. The EU is offering cooperation in a series of areas that go beyond what the EU usually proposes to third countries, such as exceptional provisions for cooperation in the areas of sanctions, restrictive measures, consular cooperation, space and defence cooperation, in addition to a number of thematic dialogues proposed in other areas. 2 weeks ago, exactly today, the high-level meeting took place between Prime Minister Johnson and the three presidents of the European institutions. Both sides stated that the UK and the EU are both ready to intensify the talks now in July to create the, quote, most conducive conditions for concluding an agreement soon. So I do hope that both sides will use the month of July to give the negotiations a new impetus. One thing is clear, the European Parliament will continue to be vigilant for the remaining months of the negotiations, both what concerns the content of the future agreement, but also in relation to the effective implementation of the withdrawal agreement. That's all from my side. Thank you.
David, thank you very much. Mircea, are you happy to go next? I hope you can hear me.
I think, Lisa, would you jump in?
No, you go ahead. That's great.
I go ahead. Okay. Sorry for a little bit of the technological innuendo. Let me say just a few words from a NATO perspective. And also, I'm coming from Romania, so I come from a nation that is both NATO and EU. And for us, there is not much distinction between these two sides of the same coin, European Union and NATO. UK's departure from the European Union has been, in a way, a little bit overshadowed by the pandemic, but its ramifications are still here. In sheer numbers, the departure of the UK are making the following situation be actual in NATO. Today, with the UK outside of the EU, 80% of total defense budgeting in NATO is procured, is produced, is paid by non-EU nations. So 80% of total budget of the allied nations, 30 nations, produced by non-EU countries. And of course, US and Canada, we know this already, but UK now, with Norway, with Turkey. So that's a massive number. Secondly, something which is important for continental Europe, that today, after the UK's departure from the EU, we have 90% of the population of EU member states also being part of NATO allied states. So what I'm seeing here is, number one, NATO becoming, with UK's departure, even more political in terms of platform of engaging allies from both sides of the Atlantic. And we count, and we already feel that intensity of United Kingdom's interest in having NATO, the other big platform after leaving the EU, and becoming even more political. Secondly, there is also something which is not only about the EU and NATO in the world. It's something that we call the political West. So here in NATO, we have partners, democracies from the Asia Pacific, from Japan to South Korea to Australia or to New Zealand. So where I believe the UK will continue to play its global role is also encouraging NATO, as Mr. Stoltenberg, the Secretary General, had just mentioned in his vision about NATO 2030, to NATO to become even more global. Getting global is not only geographical, it's also topical. And my last point about this thing, it is essential it is essential that as we are starting to draw lessons learned from the pandemic, that the political West would not basically draw even more divergent lessons learned. I think this pandemic and NATO's job is to making sure that the health crisis and economic downturn do not transform into a security crisis, that the lessons learned for the political West, EU, NATO, our American and Canadian allies, our Indian, democratic friends in Asia Pacific, the other nations that love democracy, that love living in free societies, in open societies, that we stick together, we learn the lessons together, we become more resilient, and we defend even more intensely the values on which the whole political philosophy and ideology of the democratic West has been founded and should continue to fight for that. So it's a big loss for Europe, for European Union, the departure of the UK, but UK remains an immensely important player. So I think now we have to make sure that we continue to engage, and NATO is becoming now probably even a more predilect platform for the UK in its Euro-Atlantic, but also global ambitions and aspirations.
Thanks very much, Mircea. Lisa, do you want to spell out for us briefly what your vision is for how Britain interacts on security with its partners?
Yeah, thanks very much, Anand, and thank you to all the technical people who got me into this meeting just after a few difficulties. So I'm the newly appointed Shadow Foreign Secretary, and I wanted to just talk a little bit from a British perspective about where we're going as a country and what the Labour Party thinks that we need to do next to secure strong and deep alliances across the world as we leave the European Union. I should start by saying that you'll be aware that Labour was keen that the UK should remain in the European Union. That argument raged for several years, but that argument was settled by the general election in 2019. And the question that is occupying all of us in British politics is, how is Britain going to form strong alliances going forwards in a world outside of the European Union? And for all the talk of global Britain that we've had over recent years, the UK has very much gained a reputation as an alliance breaker rather than an alliance maker, which is something that I deeply regret. COVID-19 has shown why that is so problematic for the UK. We've been forced rightly to call on alliances and friendships across the world, and I hope that this marks the start of a different approach from the British government, because the challenges that we face are many, not just COVID-19, but climate change, ongoing conflict situations in Syria, which has now raged longer than the Second World War, Yemen, Libya, the breakdown of the Iran nuclear deal, and in the UK, we're still awaiting a report into Russian potential interference in the EU referendum, which has been delayed for some time. Also, the impact of COVID-19 on global poverty, which in itself is a source of instability and can lead to conflict too. All of these things are a reason that the UK very badly needs to change course and to start looking to build alliances. And we've seen in recent years in the UK how difficult it's been for a country like Britain to manage a rising Chinese state that is newly assertive and is investing in large parts of the world, alongside a United States administration that has withdrawn from many of those multilateral institutions and no longer plays a global leadership role in the way that it did. So creating a safer, more stable world for us is an absolute priority. And that is one of the reasons why NATO, which has always been incredibly important to the United Kingdom, becomes even more important to us as we move into the future. And we are very keen to see the government strengthen and deepen our ties with NATO and our relationships with NATO allies. But one of the key lessons from Brexit here in the UK is that those global institutions often feel very remote and distant to people. And we think there is a huge amount of work that needs to be done, not just here in the UK, but across the world, in terms of restoring and defending the legitimacy of those institutions to make sure that they command broad public support. Our relationships with our European friends and allies will continue to matter to the United Kingdom, and we are keen to ensure that this government doesn't put narrow partisan politics before our shared prosperity and security. That's one of the reasons why the Labour Party has remained in the Party of European Socialists. We've left the European Union, but our future will lie with our European friends and allies, and it's important that we continue to do so. With the major institutions, G7, G20, the UN Security Council, currently gridlocked, we believe the UK needs new and broader alliances in order to defend the rule of law, human rights and democracy, which are under threat and in retreat. Recently, we called on Canada and Australia to stand with us in the face of aggressive behaviour by the Chinese government in Hong Kong. But on COVID and the global response to COVID, the UK has been conspicuous by our absence. And we're very keen to see that change. If you contrast this government in the UK with the efforts that Macron has made in France to secure a global ceasefire, the efforts that Australia and Canada have made to secure a global agreement around a vaccine, diagnostics and treatment, we think there is far more that the UK could and should be doing. And we need to build those alliances too, because we've seen here in the UK how through our 5G network and the reliance on Huawei, that our national security has been called into question. We simply don't have a homegrown alternative on 5G at the moment, so we need to build new alliances with other countries in order to do so. And finally, we need to restate a commitment to aid. You'll have seen the news perhaps that the UK government has just abolished the Department for International Development and has a strong direction of travel about trying to roll aid into trade negotiations and make it a tool in trade negotiations. We think this is a huge strategic mistake because a poorer world is a less stable world, and this is a very dangerous moment with COVID-19 and the impact on economies across the world, particularly in developing countries. I suppose this is an argument for more ambition. We think that Britain is out of the European Union, but that is no reason why Britain should withdraw from the world. And we are pushing this government to be far more ambitious. There have been moments in our history when we have stepped forward, whether it was on multilateral disarmament, on the global push against climate change, action in the Balkans, and through the initiative that William Hague pioneered when he was the Foreign Secretary around tackling violence against women and girls. There are moments when the UK has stepped up. And of course, it was a Labour Foreign Secretary, Ernest Bevin, who played a leading role in helping to found NATO. Originally, we believe that this is a moment when the UK needs to rediscover its ambition and connect outwards again to the world.
Brilliant. Thanks ever so much, Lisa. I'd love if we can come back to this question of domestic consent, because it strikes me as absolutely fundamental. And I'd encourage people to send in their questions on Zoom and I can pose them to the panelists. But before we get questions in, David, if I can just turn back to you, given what you've said about the negotiations and given the fact that the British government doesn't seem particularly keen on negotiating foreign policy at the moment in this first set of negotiations, how do you think the EU should work with the UK going forward on foreign policy? Or should it be, as we've just heard, that maybe NATO becomes a fulcrum for that and there is something of a lack of UK-EU collaboration when it comes to foreign and security policy?
Well, you've named exactly the problem I see. The UK government until now hasn't published a draft legal text on foreign and security policy, and therefore it's not one of the 11 negotiating tables currently open during the negotiations. We have to accept this as a matter of fact, that the UK government is showing, at least until now, no interest at all in having this part of foreign policy and security policy being negotiated for the future partnership agreement. So we can only discuss what the EU has offered the UK. And as I mentioned, I think it's something unique. Never before has a third country been offered such a close cooperation on so many fields, not only on foreign affairs, on sanctions, restrictive measures, consular cooperation or space, but also on defense, because we believe that the role of European common security and defense policy will increase in the next few years, even though we are fully aware that this all happens under the framework of NATO, because NATO provides security in Europe. So the UK has been invited to participate in CSTP operations and missions. They've been invited to get involved in the activities of the European Defence Agency. They can take part in projects under the Permanent Structured Cooperation, PESCO, in accordance with the relevant union law. So the offer is there, but it takes two to tango. And in the moment, the UK is obviously very much focusing on trade issues, and let's see how far we can get. In the meantime, the cooperation between the European allies and the UK will then focus more on NATO or the other institutions Lisa was mentioning, the OSCE, the United Nations, G7 and G20.
Okay. So in that sense, Mircea, do you sort of in a way see this as an opportunity for NATO to be not only the bridge between Europe and the United States and Canada, but in some ways a bridge between the European Union and the UK when it comes to security policy?
Yeah, let me. We are working in NATO on a few things that I believe could and should represent a massive lessons learned from the pandemic. For the last 5 years or so, since the NATO summit in Warsaw, the NATO leaders have instructed us, the alliance, to work on what we call baseline requirements on resilience. 7 of those, including telecom, including energy, including infrastructures, including civilian military cooperation, name it. We have just upgraded the recent defense ministers meeting of NATO, where, by the way, we had Sweden and Finland participating like always, Josep Borrell participating like always, and for the first time, the lady defense minister of Australia, who made an exceptional positive impression on all of us. So what I'm just saying that as we speak, NATO and the EU, with the UK inside NATO at this point in time, we are working on a broader concept of resilience. So what NATO does well will continue to do well, and we've upgraded the 7 baseline requirements on resilience that I mentioned, but also the EU is bringing complementary elements of our common resilience when it comes to foreign ownership, critical supply chains, issues that NATO is not equipped or we don't have in our mandate to be doing. But if NATO and the EU, with the UK there at the table, like always an important and active participant, will be doing some form of broader resilience, this will help us stay strong inside the EU and NATO. This will have a way to engage, let's say, China in a more homogeneous way, in a more integrated way. And we've been watching here in NATO, of course, with great interest, and we've been briefed on the EU-China recent summit, which was, of course, a VTC one. If we decide, as Secretary General Stoltenberg mentioned, for NATO to go more global, if you want, even more global than now, we have to decide together, how can we work on the other side of the coin from resilience, which is fragility? We have lots of fragile states on our borders, to the south, to the east. And I do believe that if we join forces, NATO and the EU, and other democracies and other global institutions, the World Bank, the UN, the OECD, they have important work on fragility. So if we can strengthen our resilience as the democratic political West And we can also, including through humanitarian aid. I was talking to Kristalina Georgieva from the IMF, speaking of debt relief. We are talking also to G7 and sometimes G20 nations in making sure that we also help the very fragile states on our peripheries. So if we can get our act together here, I do believe that we have, number one, a more convergent lessons learned from the pandemic. We'll become stronger economically. We'll become more sovereign, if you want, from a EU perspective, not in terms of telling no to our American, Canadian, or British friends from our common endeavor, but making sure that we protect the crown jewels of our economy, that we have enough venture capital available for our SMEs when they innovate and not be purchased on a sort of a shopping spree from nations that might be using that technology against our interests, against our citizens, in mass surveillance, in things that are not okay and not according to the democratic norms of our societies. So this is where I believe the UK, but NATO and the EU, we have a massive, important role to play together. Each of our institutions respecting their mission statement. NATO is a defensive alliance. EU is a political union and with lots of things, a common market and all these things. But if we really join forces and if we really don't duplicate and put our resources at the right place at the right time with the same intensity and vision, nobody can compete with us. Because for the first time, and that's my last observation, for the first time in the last half a millennia, the West and its superiority in technology is contested. It's the first time in half a millennia. So I do believe that if we want to continue to be not dominant, but to be relevant in world affairs, we have to stick together. And this is why the UK will continue to be, no matter how complicated British politics might appear, and they are, that's a democracy, that you are an indispensable bridge for the European and Euro-Atlantic communities, and from those to the global political West. This is one of the most important struggles and competition for dominance and relevance in the world we have witnessed in many, many centuries. And we have to be up to this important task.
Thank you. I should just mention that Mircea has to leave a bit early at about 5:02. So if you have specific questions on NATO, if you want to send them in the next few minutes, we can put those to him. But Lisa, do you want to come back on anything you've heard?
Just that I think there's just one reflection on the, just listening to Mircea then as well, is that I think there's a moment approaching where the world has got to decide post the COVID and the immediate health crisis around COVID, whether we pull together or whether we break apart. And I think it's far from inevitable which path we'll currently take. Already you can see populist, nationalist voices, some in government, some not in government, but really making the running in a number of countries and setting the political weather, who are arguing that the response to COVID-19 has to be to shut borders, to put up protectionist barriers, to scapegoat migrants, and to attack and undermine those global institutions, whether NATO, the World Health Organization, or even the European Union, which has been itself been under strain, although I think that debate has been much overstated, given that EU countries were able to come together and formulate a fairly robust response, certainly an economic response that hasn't been replicated across the globe. But there's a moment approaching where we are going to have to decide which side we're all on in that battle about whether the world pulls together or breaks apart. And I am very clear that Britain has to be one of the leading voices that seeks to strengthen and renew our global relationships and our multilateral institutions. And we've been pressing the government here very hard to do so. But I think this is really a wake-up call for those people in British politics who believe that we could somehow go it alone in this brave new world. I think COVID-19 has shown that we're only as strong as the most vulnerable across the world, and we're going to have a level of global leadership that we haven't seen in recent years, and all countries, including Britain, are going to have to play their part in making sure that that happens. But I just think this is far from inevitable. I think the challenge is enormous, and it's one of the reasons that I was really pleased to do this event today, because I think these conversations between partners are really important at the moment.
Thank you, Lisa. David, there's a couple of questions. Well, we've heard a very ambitious sort of agenda for NATO set out by Mircea. There's two questions that pull in slightly different directions about the EU here. The first is from Anand, who says that maybe this is a sort of ideal opportunity for the EU to strengthen its cooperation in defence and foreign affairs. And then another question from João Cravinho, who says, is there a danger that with the UK leaving, and the UK is a prominent Atlantic and maritime power, that the EU becomes excessively centred on its immediate neighbourhood at the expense of a sort of broader view of international security? Would you like to come back on either or both of those?
Yes, thank you. Well, the European Parliament has been calling for a closer cooperation on security, defence and foreign affairs for many, many years. And we do hope that under this new commission led by Ursula von der Leyen, we will actually make progress. But of course, in the end, it all depends on the 27 member states. What we often see is on speeches given on Sunday, representatives, people responsible in the capitals of our member states, underline the importance of close cooperation on foreign affairs and defence, but they forget what they have said on Sundays when they start work again on Monday. Ursula von der Leyen has called her commission a geopolitical commission. And that was a wise move from my side, because this says what it's all about. Already before COVID-19, we knew that the European Union would have to position itself in an increasingly competitive and challenging world. The High Representative, Josep Borrell, has his office now again in the Berlaymont. He's moved back, which I also thought was a good signal. The Commission has an agenda point on foreign and global affairs at every meeting. So I think the framework has been set, but now we need to strengthen our European External Action Service. But it's all about getting the 27 member states together. As the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, I'm entitled to attend twice a year the Foreign Affairs Council meetings in the so-called Gimli format, and I've witnessed myself what an incredible task it is for Josep Borrell, but also the last term for Federica Mogherini, to get 27 member states following the same line. Often you have the case that one or two or three countries are blocking any progress. That's why I'm, and not only me, but many of my colleagues in the European Parliament, we support qualified majority voting also on foreign affairs. And we should make use of the opportunities the European Treaty provides us here. Just as one example, a European Security Council proposed by President Macron and Chancellor Merkel could also be a step forward, also to include the United Kingdom in European security policy. So there are many, many ways to go. A final point, as being half British and owner of a British passport since I was born, I deeply regret Brexit. I think it's a historic mistake, but we have to accept reality. If there's one positive thing about Brexit, you have seen that since 2016, we have probably made more progress on European security and defence policy than in the 40 years before, because no longer was the British side fundamentally opposing smaller steps forward like the European Defence Fund, the European Defence Agency, the Permanent Structured Cooperation, or the EU military headquarters. So these are things where we have made real progress, but still the UK, also as a non-EU country, is invited to participate. So to answer the question, yes, I hope that the next years will be an opportunity for finally strengthening our cooperation, but I hope this call is heard in some of the capitals of our member states.
It's really interesting. All three of you, in different ways, have sort of painted sort of open, internationalist, collaborative visions of the future. And I just wonder, are you all confident that those are the lessons that people and politicians will take from the COVID pandemic? I mean, it seems to me they could go one of two ways. We can either say, as Lisa did, that what this shows is we need to work together better, whereas we're only as strong as the weakest link in the international chain. Or it can be a massive focus on national resilience, on national self-reliance, on a slight turning inwards and a closing down of borders. Are you all confident that it's the former that's going to triumph after the pandemic and not the latter? In any order?
Because I will need to go and participate in a NATO UN conversation. And congratulations to our UN friends on the 75th anniversary. That's a paramount organization. And speaking of multilateral institutions, that's something that all of us need to continue to support. And the UK, as a permanent member of Security Council, will continue to play its role. I don't know. The answer is, we only hope that part of the lessons learned will be the need for more collaboration and continue to pull resources together. Also, there is a reality, there is a backlash against some form of globalized aspects of world governance, some form of hyper-capitalism, very intense, producing inequalities. We see also populist trends in our societies. We are democracies, and that's a fact of life. We also have seen the ascent of more green and climate, let's say, interested segments, especially of the young population. What I'd like to say before excusing myself and moving to the next thing, there is a process of lessons learned, but there is also a process from the pandemic. There is also a broader foresight, if you want, towards the world that is about to establish itself in a sort of a new normal. And we do this in NATO. We have a reflection process. Jens Stoltenberg presented his vision on NATO 2030. European Union is working on a future of Europe conversation, a strategic compass. But as a veteran of integration for both NATO and EU, I remember, as foreign minister of my country, having put my august signature on the European Constitution in 2004 in Rome. So what I'm just trying to to tell, that we can still influence the outcome of this pandemic and of this stage of global affairs. And if we stick together, at least we compare notes. If NATO and EU will continue to see, despite the differences that might occur, that we are coming with a set of common understanding about the future, I think we'll be in good shape. If we continue to have some form of autism and have only national answers to what we are listening from our public opinions and from our societies, then we could be in trouble. NATO is has been successful, always in making sure that any crisis, be it economic, social, or health, is not transformed into a security crisis. So what we should avoid by all means is a sort of a perfect storm, when things coming from various corners of the world, from various tensions, from various sparks or fireworks, someplace or another, would not be creating a more difficult situation. I remain optimistic. I think the lessons learned will be leading us towards more cooperation. I think the need for a strong transatlantic unity of democracies. You mentioned that in 27 it's not easy to have consensus. We are 30 at NATO, and I have to say that you're right. It's not always easy to have consensus on everything, but I'm confident that our values, that our foundation of democracy and open societies will be prevailing. So finger crossed, buckle up. It's going to be relatively agitated, but I keep full confidence in our capacity to jointly find the answer and design a better future.
Thank you, Mircea. I think you might have to go any second now. So thank you very, very much for your contribution to this. David, are you happy to respond?
No, I just said
confident and optimistic.
Yes, I'm also optimistic. I think what people have understood is that we're all in this together, and that this virus knows no borders, and nor should our response know any kind of borders. And what we've particularly noticed in Europe is that open borders, for me personally, the most important integration step we've seen in the last 25 years, that we no longer have border controls. My home country, Germany, is surrounded by countries within the Schengen Cooperation, but it was perhaps a shock for the younger generation what it actually means when all of a sudden borders are closed between Germany and France, or between Slovakia and Austria. And a lot of politicians also notice that in this single market, we are now heavily dependent on open borders. And we also now have hundreds of thousands of citizens crossing national borders every day to commute to work. And this is what the European integration is about. It's about getting rid of borders. I consider European borders, internal borders, as rather artificial in the year 2020.
Lisa.
I mean, I think this is quite difficult actually, because, you know, on the one hand, I feel, you know, as I said earlier, I feel very strongly that the world has to pull together, and that is the right lesson to draw from COVID. Just even listening to David talking about the discussion about open borders, you know, a lot of the debate around COVID has been, you know, countries understandably in the short term having to close borders, but, you know, a lot of the populist or far right forces across Europe, including here in the UK, using this moment to try to reverse that trend, to try to scapegoat migrants. And I think it has had some traction. So there's a public opinion battle that needs to be won as well. And I think this is the part of the reason why this level of global cooperation is really important. I mean, if you think about the global response to COVID, there was quite a lengthy period of debate between different EU nations about how to best support the southern states. There was in the UK, there was a complete refusal to learn from other countries that had experienced COVID earlier, and still now no real evidence that we are reaching out, listening, learning, you know, replicating plans that other countries have successfully made in other parts of the world. There's the efforts to find an agreement on a global ceasefire stalled. We've seen a rise of vaccine nationalism amongst different countries. So I think there are reasons to be quite pessimistic about it. The reason that I say that is because I believe this is a fight that we have to have and we have to win. And in many ways, COVID has magnified some of the trends that were already there and some of those pressures in the political system across the world. And so I think now is the moment where we have to really start to win that argument out in the public and to make that argument. And that's what we've been trying to do here in the United Kingdom, because if you look at some of the ways in which countries have come together to cooperate during COVID, particularly, you know, I mentioned earlier that the EU were able to reach an agreement, which we're yet to see replicated at the global economic level, although there is progress, but it's very slow to help developing countries. But if you look particularly at the medical and scientific cooperation that there's been across the world, it has been quite extraordinary to witness the scale and the depth of that, and the way in which those medical and scientific researchers have been able to pull together, even when it was becoming politically very difficult, particularly when the US decided to announce that it was pulling out of the World Health Organization, and it became a very politicized environment for them to work in. Yet still, they've been able to maintain that level of cooperation to the benefit of all of us. So I think there are reasons to be optimistic, because I think that the argument is right and it can be won. But I think that the forces on the other side are lining up very strongly in order to try to take us down a different route and to see a world that breaks apart in response to COVID. So now is the moment where we have to have that battle. And I think the lesson from Brexit in the United Kingdom is that you don't just you don't just reach global agreement about these things in boardrooms. You have to go out into communities and you have to make the case and win the argument.
David, do you accept the fact that there is a danger that the sort of populists will try and make hay on the back of the pandemic, and to argue that actually, you know, problems come from outside, and that this might actually get even worse as the sort of expected economic impact of the lockdown hits our economies, and if unemployment goes up, one of the things we quite frequently see at that point is a sort of rise in the strength of populism.
Mm-hmm.
Do you accept that that is a challenge facing member states?
Yes, of course it's a challenge. Populists never try to miss an opportunity to gain influence. But what we've seen in the last few weeks is that serious politicians have dealt more successful with this unprecedented challenge than populists. And we look at the countries where we're facing the largest difficulties. Brazil, the United States, just to name two very sad examples. And what you've, for instance, seen in my home country, Germany, is a rise in support for my political party, the Christian Democratic Union. And this has a lot to do with the leadership, which has been shown by Angela Merkel. Populists give very simple, oversimple answers for very difficult questions, and they're good at criticizing and attacking the government. But when it comes to real hard political work, when it comes to showing political responsibility, populists are usually absolutely no good. So if you look at the polls for the Alternative für Deutschland, the so-called alternative for Germany, they've gone down during the last few weeks. And they've gone down for good reasons, because the AfD isn't capable of delivering concrete answers. So what we're seeing is a very mixed picture. I do hope that in the Western democracies, serious political forces will gain influence, and populists from the far right, but let me also add from the far left, they're just as bad, will lose influence. And one thing is clear, since we're all in this together, we need to, on a global stage, to form an alliance of those moderate political forces who are in favor of multilateralism, who know that we can only coordinate these enormous challenges. We do this together, and the European Union is in this alliance of multilateralist countries like Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, India, just to name a few. And we do hope that the United Kingdom will continue to play this role. I'm actually quite positive, but because despite the UK regrettably leaving the European Union, this great country remains a member of the Security Council in the United Nations, and all UK governments, have they been Conservative or Labour-led, always knew that global leadership by the UK is very important. So I do hope that the UK will have the power and the willingness to continue to strengthen international organizations like the United Nations, but also continue to be engaged in NATO, the OSCE, G7, G20, and many others.
I mean, it's a very impressive list of countries, David. I just wonder whether one of the problems with this sort of multilateral future is it's quite hard to find the consensus that's going to be necessary to get states to actually act. So, for instance, when it comes to dealing with Russia or to our new European approach to China, do you think that the consensus is there to allow for meaningful collective action?
Well, first of all, you need a consensus that you need multilateral frameworks, and that the world of the 21st century isn't about striking deals between two partners. It's about the multilateral organizations that small countries, medium-sized countries, and big countries all have their rights and obligations, that we have to go away from this ideology that the one who has the most power can dictate other countries what to do. So that's, first of all, important. That's why I deeply regret that our American, and let me underline this, allies and partners, and they've been our allies and partners for so many decades, are withdrawing from international organizations. It should be the exact opposite. What we need now is to strengthen the United Nations. We need to strengthen the World Health Organization. We need to strengthen the World Trade Organization. We should try and make like the Iranian nuclear deal. We need to implement what we have agreed together instead of pulling out. And I haven't even mentioned the Paris Climate Accord yet. So I do hope that after the US elections, under a new US administration, we will see more US commitment in these international organizations alongside their traditional partners and allies in Europe and in other parts of the world. And of course, we need these multilateral international organizations also to deal with countries who have different ideas and different interests than us. I'll just name two, China and Russia. But we need to talk to them. We need dialogue. We need specific formats instead of this new policy where one country is striking deals with another country and third countries are not involved. That is not the future.
I mean, Lisa, you might not want to answer this, but let's try it anyway. I mean, Brexit and the attitude towards the EU aside, do you have faith that the British government has multilateralist instincts?
I think this has been a wake-up call for a lot of people within the Conservative Party, and that, you know, when you look at what happened very quickly, the UK was forced to reach out across the world in order to seek help, whether it was with personal protective equipment or with, we turned to India for paracetamol, China for personal protective equipment, to the US for ventilators, and to friends across Europe as well. So I think there was definitely a moment where a number of formerly quite isolationist cabinet ministers suddenly started to realise the value of cooperation. But I wouldn't overstate it. I think there's a real confusion at the heart of government about how it wants to engage with the rest of the world. And there's particular confusion in relation to where we build our alliances. And that is playing out very much in British politics around the issue of China at the moment. I mean, I very much agree with David that there is, you know, the UK needs far greater strategic independence to be able to deal with the rise of China. That means we need more investment in homegrown industries, and we need to strengthen our global alliances with other partners, other democratic countries as well. But we also need constructive engagement with China, which is partly why these multilateral institutions are so important, because they provide maybe not a framework currently for resolution, but they do provide a framework for dialogue. So they remain incredibly important even in the short and immediate term, particularly when you consider that COVID-19 isn't the only challenge we face, climate change as well. That constructive engagement is what makes this, the comparisons to a sort of Cold War situation, fairly inappropriate in my view. That this is a far more complex situation that the UK needs to manage and to think through from our own national security perspective. And at the moment, there's a real tension in government, because on the one hand, you have people like Dominic Raab, who is my opposite number in government, who I think is taking a fairly sort of what you would call a fairly hawkish approach to China, you know, wants to see more of a renewed emphasis, I suspect, on national security. But at the same time, if you listen to the voices coming out of the Treasury and to the Chancellor, they very much see Chinese investment as part of the key to Britain's economic recovery. And what all this points to really is that at the moment, the United Kingdom is lacking a foreign policy approach that isn't just seen through the lens of trade and growth. We don't really have a strategy at home, and we don't really have a strategy abroad. And that is going to have to change, and it's going to have to change very quickly, which is one of the reasons why in the Labour Party we've put such an emphasis on foreign policy in the last few weeks, because although obviously and understandably everyone's attention is preoccupied by the immediate health crisis posed by COVID, this is something that the UK government urgently needs to sort out if we're going to maintain a a prosperous and secure future, and it will become a problem for us very, very quickly. So we've been putting the pressure on them to see if they can resolve it.
Okay, we've got 1 minute left, I make it. So very, very quickly as a final question. I mean, the immediate problems of the Brexit talks notwithstanding, are you both confident that we have enough shared interest in the EU to mean that ultimately we will find a way to work together constructively and creatively when it comes to foreign and security policy? Don't all rush at once.
Lisa.
Okay, shall I go first, and then hopefully we'll inject a note of positivity into proceedings that then David can kill off if he feels like it. I mean, I've been really heartened by, since I took on this post a few weeks ago, Keir Starmer and I have been doing introductory calls and meetings with progressive leaders all over the world, and we started, of course, with our friends and allies across the European Union, and I've been really heartened by the warmth with which we've been greeted and the importance that our friends in other democratic countries place on the relationship with Britain. And from my point of view, from our point of view, those relationships will continue to be very important. I think I mentioned before, that's why we stayed in the Party of European Socialists, because we are out of the European Union and that is now settled, but our future does lie with Europe, and those relationships will continue to be very important to us going forwards, nowhere more so than in the field of security, intelligence and defence. Neighbours matter, geography matters. That's one of the lessons, I think, of the last few years. And so I am optimistic about it. David will know that I, like the rest of the Labour front bench, campaigned very strongly to remain in the European Union. But I think there's a danger that we end up fighting the last battles and forget that actually we've got work to do now, and we have got a job to do now. It's to make sure that the world pulls together. So I think those relationships continue to be important, and perhaps there's been a sort of learning moment in government. I don't want to overstate the optimism, but perhaps there has been a learning moment in government about that during COVID that we can use in order to secure our future.
David, you have the last word.
Well, the next round of negotiations has started today. Both sides have shown their willingness and hopefully their determination that we can still find an agreement. We have exactly 4 months and 2 days left to agree on a legally ready text. I'd say it's a 50-50 chance. I strongly believe it would be better if we can see the UK leave the single market and the customs union on the basis of a partnership agreement. I think much will depend now on the political leadership in London. But despite of Brexit, one thing is clear, as Lisa just also pointed out: the UK and the EU will continue to share principles, values and interests. So that's why it's in both sides' interest to maintain an ambitious, close and lasting cooperation. And this also includes foreign affairs, security and defence. The British are not sailing away to Newfoundland. They will be our neighbours and partners for the future, and our door will, by the way, always remain open.
Thank you very, very much indeed to both of you, and to Mircea. Thank you all for watching, and go and enjoy the rest of what is a fantastic conference with a superb programme. All the best to all of you. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks both.
Thank you.
Thank you.